The lockdown had been tough on everyone. For James, it was a time of profound isolation. Living alone in a small apartment, he found himself retreating into the past, reminiscing about the days when life was simpler. Social media became his lifeline, a way to reconnect with old friends and pass the time. One evening, while scrolling through his friends list, James stumbled upon a name he hadn't thought about in years: Daniel Matthews. Daniel had been James's best friend in high school. They had been inseparable, always sitting together in class, hanging out after school, and planning their futures. But after graduation, life had pulled them in different directions. Daniel had moved to another city for college, and they gradually lost touch. Seeing his name now, amidst the loneliness of lockdown, sparked a wave of nostalgia in James. He clicked on Daniel's profile, which was surprisingly active, with recent posts and updates. James sent a friend request, and within minutes, Daniel accepted. The conversation started light and easy, just like old times. They laughed about high school memories, the pranks they pulled, and the teachers they couldn't stand. Daniel seemed just as eager to reconnect, and soon, they were chatting every day. It felt like no time had passed at all. But as the days turned into weeks, James began to notice odd things. Daniel's messages would sometimes appear out of order, with responses to questions James hadn't asked yet. At first, he brushed it off as a glitch, a common occurrence on social media platforms. But then, the inconsistencies became more frequent. Daniel would reference events or people from their school days that James didn't remember, things that didn't match up with his own memories. One night, James mentioned a mutual friend from high school, Sarah, asking if Daniel knew what she was up to these days. There was a long pause before Daniel replied, "Who's Sarah?" James was taken aback. Sarah had been part of their close-knit group, just as inseparable as he and Daniel. They had spent countless weekends together, going to the movies, studying for exams, and attending parties. How could Daniel have forgotten her? "You know Sarah. She was always with us. The one who used to drive us around in her dad's car," James typed, waiting for the familiar ping of a response. But Daniel's reply never came. Hours passed, and the chat window remained silent. The next day, Daniel's profile was gone. James was confused. He tried searching for Daniel's profile, but it seemed to have vanished. There was no trace of him online. No photos, no posts, nothing. It was as if Daniel had never existed. Panic started to set in. Had he imagined the whole thing? But no, the chat history was still there. Or at least parts of it were. The messages from Daniel were fragmented, some missing entirely, and the ones that remained were filled with strange gaps. Determined to figure out what was happening, James decided to dig deeper. He went through his old yearbooks, looking for photos of Daniel. But as he flipped through the pages, his heart sank. There was no Daniel Matthews in the yearbook. No pictures, no mention of him in the class roster. Nothing. James felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. How could this be? He tried calling some of his old classmates, but none of them remembered Daniel. They all insisted that James had never had a best friend named Daniel. One even joked that James must be confusing him with someone else. But James knew he wasn't mistaken. He remembered Daniel vividly. Their late-night talks, the plans they made to travel the world, the day Daniel had tearfully confided in him about his parents' divorce. James's search grew frantic. He looked through old photographs, yearbooks, and even his school records, trying to find any evidence of Daniel's existence. But everywhere he looked, there was nothing. It was as if Daniel had been erased from history. In desperation, James visited his parents' house, hoping to find something there. He dug through boxes of old memorabilia, searching for anything that could prove Daniel was real. Finally, he found a photograph, tucked away in a dusty photo album. It was a picture of him and Daniel standing in front of their high school, arms slung around each other's shoulders. James felt a wave of relief. There it was, proof that Daniel had existed. But when he looked closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The face next to his in the photo wasn't Daniel's. It was someone else's, another classmate he barely remembered. A boy he had hardly spoken to during his school years. James stared at the photo, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. How could his memories be so wrong? That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay awake, replaying every interaction he had ever had with Daniel, trying to convince himself that it hadn't all been in his head. But the more he thought about it, the more the memories seemed to slip away, like sand through his fingers. The next morning, James logged into his computer, determined to find Daniel's profile again. But when he opened his chat history, all the messages from Daniel were gone. The profile was still missing, as if it had never existed. In its place was a blank space, as though Daniel had been deleted from the internet entirely. James felt a deep sense of loss, as if he had not just lost a friend, but a part of himself. He couldn't explain what had happened, and no one else seemed to believe him. But in the back of his mind, a terrifying thought lingered. What if Daniel had never existed at all? What if he was just a figment of James's imagination, a creation of his mind during the loneliness of lockdown? As the days passed, James found himself questioning everything he knew. The boundaries between reality and memory blurred, leaving him unsure of what was real. He withdrew from his friends, stopped responding to messages, and spent his days combing through old documents, searching for any trace of Daniel. But there was nothing. Daniel had vanished without a trace, leaving James alone with his doubts and fears. In the end, James was left with a chilling realization. If Daniel wasn't real, then what else in his life was an illusion? How much of his past was a fabrication, a construct of his mind? And if he could forget someone as important as Daniel, then what else could he lose? The thought haunted him, leaving him isolated and paranoid, a prisoner of his own memories.